All right, we're gonna bring the facilities, the financial affairs meeting to order. I'll start with a roll call, starting with, we'll start on the phone with Jenny and Joel. The roll call.
Present, Joel Fishbein.
Here, Jennifer Lohman.
And we'll go to
Julie Haywood, present.
David Cohen, present.
Daniel Schultz, present.
Leah Mulhern, present.
Zachary Epps, present.
Pamela Henry, present.
Charles Williams, present.
Okay. So can I have a motion to approve our minutes from the last meeting?
So moved. Zachary Epps.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. The meetings have been approved, the minutes. And then I will turn it over to Mr. Swigart for the financial affairs committee meeting,
Thank you, Pam.
or the finance committee.
All right, on tonight's agenda, we will, as usual, discuss the interim financial statements with one new exciting schedule to the next, the historical local revenue collections that we always talk about. So if you might just make it a part of the package we take a look at each month. Also taking a look at the budget timeline, the steps that we go through to pass the budget through the end of the school year, the Act 1 timeline, which is the skeleton, so to speak, in which the budget timeline is based to pass the budget through the end of the school year. There is some outstanding legislation regarding charter school policy and funding that I was hoping to talk about because that advocacy seems to be ramping up as of late. And then there's one agenda item, which is the PennDOT eminent domain taking some school district property that's on the agenda for the next board meeting. All right, so why don't we get started? We'll take a look at the balance sheet of the school district. And I apologize if this all sounds redundant. In the accounting world, redundancy is a good thing. Predictability is a good thing. So again, looking at the balance sheet of the Cheltenham School District through October 31st, you can see that our cash position continues to remain strong. Year-over-year increase of 13.3 million. You can see on the prepaid expenditure column here in 2024 for this fiscal year ending October 31st, 2023, you can see our prepaid expense dropped. That's reflected, that was discussed at the prior finance meeting, the adjustment to prepaid expenditures for a prepaid CPAS item that has been since absorbed throughout the past decade. The other item I wanted to point out was you see on the list of assets and on the list of liabilities, that is our cumulative balance of taxes receivable. So any receivables that aren't collected by the deadline in January are remitted to the county as delinquent and accumulated at the county level. You can see that number has dropped considerably year over year, which is an indication of a strong community, a strong tax base. So that number dropped from 3.3 million to 2.8 million year over year, and that's reflected as an asset and a liability on the district's balance sheet. All right, so looking at our financial performance year over year and focusing on our revenues over expenditures through the first 4 months of the school year. You can see our local revenues year over year are up $3.8 million. This is all primarily due to real estate taxes and interest income. Our state and federal revenue is relatively flat, all things considered. On the expenditure side, if you look at total expenditures, there's only a change of $112,000 year over year. Last year having spent 32.6 million, this year having spent 32.7 million. We are behind on some bills. Again, a timing issue. So we have about $800,000 of charter school invoices that just crossed my desk last week and will be reflected in November's financial statements that last year at this time were reflected in October's. That makes up the majority of this difference here, the decrease in our regular education. So that's just all timing of charter school bill payment. They're a little slower this year due to some turnover, but that is all caught up as of today. On the special ed side, we have paid our IU bills a little quicker than in the prior year. We prepaid, front-loaded most of them this school year. That's due to some stability in our special ed department. The only other item I had to point out was central services. These are technology purchases. This number should be very comparative by the time we look at it in November and won't be showing a decrease year over year. Looking at revenues versus expenditures, we still are right on track. If I had to superimpose last year's expenditures and revenues, it would probably look something like this year to date. So we're following a similar trend line, a similar curve as we approach our full budget of $132 million through the end of the school year. Last on the interim financial statements, I thought it would be helpful to take a 5-year look back at our most significant local taxes. These are taxes collected from the community from Cheltenham Township, with the exception of investments. But you can see our real estate taxes follow a pretty steady pattern based on tax rate and assessment, with the one exception of 2020, which is right in the heart of COVID. So I'm guessing there's a slower collection rate in that period of time. That didn't look, potentially the board may have changed the collection dates themselves. A lot of school boards did that back in COVID. But that being the most significant item, also wanted to point out earnings on investments. Year to date, we are pushing $1 million of interest earnings, whereas 2 years ago we were barely breaking $1,000. So we are right now gauging whether we are at the peak of the prime rate, the prime bank rate, and whether we need to be locking in some of our investments for a longer term. Typically in the school district world, we don't lock in our cash for more than a year because of the need to spend it. But here we have a healthy fund balance. We think we're at the crescendo of where interest rates are going to head. So we are looking at purchasing some potentially 2-year investment vehicles to lock in some of those rates. Hopefully we can spread out our interest earnings a little longer rather than seeing a drop off. Any questions on the interim financial statement reports?
One question around 22-23 real estate tax difference, which looks like it's 3.5%, but I believe that is we only increased the budget 1.1%, or is there a trail? What explains that sizable difference?
So this is just pure cash basis. So there are some sizable banks and there are some sizable taxpayers who may have paid it November 1st versus October 31st. So there's a timing issue. It all settles out at the end of the day when that whole tax window cycle is closed. That's pretty much through December. It should be very stagnant through the end of the day.
So just to repeat back what I heard to make sure I understood it, if we looked at this in February, for instance, it's more likely that difference would be the 1.1% or closer to it.
Yes, with the added difference of I don't even know the name of the old golf course as that continues to be developed.
Right.
Those are additional assessments. Those are additional tax dollars coming in that weren't built or completed at the time of the budget and are additional on top of that 1.1%. So it might be a little more than that.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the interim financial statements?
Just to follow up without getting too much detail, it might also have an impact in terms of the amount of money in terms of properties going off the tax rolls to nonprofits and or entering the tax rolls, and also reassessments, even though they're few and far between.
We were currently in a period of just a year and a half ago was a time when school districts were able, where the window was open for reassessments to bring property values back up to more equitable across the board. We're kind of in threshold where that's stable, and we'll probably start dipping down into that threshold where it goes the other way in a year or two. So yeah, right now we're really in a holding pattern in terms of assessments, and large assessment fields. I think those are not going to occur for a while at this point. Any other interim financial statement questions? All right, hearing none, I'll move on to the budget timeline. So the school district budget is really ongoing. anytime you hear any information about something that needs to be done or something that needs to be purchased, it's always, well, how is this going to fit into the budget, or how is this going to fit into the district's capital reserve spending? But the formal process begins in November, which feels entirely too early for a budget that will be completed in June. But the reality is the state starts that process by setting its Act 1 index in September, which gets the ball rolling, which gives the school district an idea of a potential tax increase if it needed one. We start getting some of our preliminary looks and our health insurance increases year over year this early. And at this point, we've been able to assess most of our collections. So we are somewhat established in our collection rate for taxes year over year. So November is really when the process gets kicked off. In December and January, primarily in December, I meet with all of the department heads and building principals one-on-one to take a look at their budget, their required spending or desired spending for the upcoming school year. I ask that those budgets are returned through the end of January and follow up, meet with any principal or director that requires it through the end of January. Once that information is collected and assembled, it is presented in the form of a preliminary budget at the February or March meeting. Should we require a tax increase that would be in excess of the District Act 1 index, this timeline would all be pushed up a month. But given that we're in a solid financial position and that doesn't look like that will be the case, will be required, we have a little more lax timeline. So after that February, March meeting, we'll review the preliminary budget. Through April, we're evaluating the attritional savings within the district following the employment contracts about when retirements have to be reported to admin. So we're looking at retirees versus new hires, what that looks like in terms of salaries and benefits. Then by May, we're advertising, we're posting our preliminary final budget, and then the budget has to be approved by June 30th. Of course, we always approve it in mid-June. How that interacts with the Act 1 timeline. Through September 30th, that's when the Act 1 index is released, which gives us our taxing ability. January 4th is our deadline to either adopt a resolution stating that we will not exceed the Act 1 index or make a preliminary budget available for public inspection. Our plan is to exceed the Act 1 index. So that puts December's board meeting as the first opportunity to pass a resolution indicating that we won't exceed the Act 1 index, which you'll see on next month's board meeting agenda in December. Through May, the Department of Education notifies us of our homestead property tax reduction. This typically hasn't been an issue that anybody talked about for decades, but then 2 years ago, the state turned around and released additional monies, which was very welcome and very needed. So now it's back on everybody's radar. Through June 10th, every district has to make its proposed final budget available for inspection or 20 days prior to the final budget adoption. So it'll be earlier than June 10th for us. We'll do it in May to advertise our final budget and probably approving it in June's board meeting, which I don't have the date in front of me, but is typically the middle of June. Any questions on the budget timeline or Act 1 timeline? All right, moving on to charter school funding. So as part of this year's budget, House Bill 1422 discussed several changes to cyber charter schools and charter schools, funding, accountability, and ethical requirements through board policy. So I know this topic has come up numerous times in the past with no success in passing. It feels a little different this time in terms of talking about the growth of cyber charter schools fund balances and comparing that to the actual cost of education in a cyber school versus the cost of education in a brick and mortar school and the amount of tuition that each district is paying and the disparity in that tuition. So school districts have to follow a required formula for calculating its tuition and fees to charter school. In essence, it's the prior year's budget divided by the number of students educated at the school district, which gives you a number. Obviously, every school district has a different number of students, and every school district has a different budget. So there's a wide variety in tuitions paid to charter schools. I think the estimate is $9,000 to $22,000 in regular education and $16,000 to $54,000 in special ed education. So you could have the same student attending a charter school on the east side of the state and the west side of the state, and one district paying $54,000 per pupil in tuition costs, and one district paying $16,000, just purely based on where that student resides, and regardless of the cost of a charter school to educate that student. Cyber charter schools are estimated to cost a regular ed student less than $9,000 a year to educate. And currently in our district, if we have a special ed cyber school student, we are paying a full $47,000 a year in tuition for a cyber school education. So this bill hopes to create a fair funding formula, which for cyber schools would be a flat tuition rate. I believe the bill proposes $8,000, may have been changed to $9,500 per student. On the special education side, it talks about creating a tiered flat tuition rate for special ed students depending on classification and need of the student, but it doesn't quite go as far as spell out exactly what that rate is as of yet. But if I were to look at those tuitions and compare it to what we're currently paying, last year we had 99.81 students. That's based on number of days attended as a charter school, a cyber charter school. We spent $1.9 million. If we use the flat rate funding formula, we would save $957,000. If we kind of extrapolate that difference in tuition to special ed, then we would have saved approximately $600,000, or a total of $1.6 million following this bill. And I think the fair funding is the key word here. What is fair funding for a cyber education when it's relatively standard that the variance in tuition is far exceeding what's actually needed to educate cyber students, cyber charter school students. The second piece of this bill is increased accountability. So statistically, there is a higher rate of low performance at charter schools versus brick and mortar schools, and there is less accountability on how charter schools need to improve the performance of their students. So this bill discusses measuring and monitoring student performance at charter schools and limiting enrollment if needed, if charter schools do not perform to standard or don't increase their performance standard amongst their students. And the third piece of this is an increase in ethical requirements. So it's requiring board policies, beefed up board policies against conflicts of interest, and operating charter schools for profit rather than what a public school model is, which is a nonprofit vehicle to educate students. So there are increased measures to limit the amount of for-profit administrative companies, management companies that run some of the charter schools within the district, and require increased requirements for annual audits of those entities. Any questions on the proposed charter school legislation?
Zachary?
Please.
Yeah, so for House Bill 1422, this reminds me of, I don't even know the number of the bill, a couple of years ago, where they did talk about a flat funding formula, which did not go far enough, didn't get approved, obviously, didn't get adopted. Do you have any sense of the momentum for this House Bill 1422? I mean, this goes even further. I love the increased accountability and the ethical standards as well.
So I think what's driving some of the momentum is the fact that it's a different administration and a different governing body looking at it. And there seems to be a momentum and desire to move this forward. I don't, in my opinion, I still see the exact same roadblocks that were there before. So I don't know if it's going anywhere, but there seems to be more momentum and more drive to get school districts on board with this and pushing for this legislation, public school districts.
But I do think it's an opportunity for us, both as a school district and individually as folks in the community, with the impact of this bill if it does pass. One, it would be really equitable funding for charter and cyber charter schools that are definitely performing below public schools and don't have the same level of accountability. So I urge us, if there's any momentum that we could pick up either through PSBA or independently as our school district to support House Bill 1422. I don't know who sponsored it Cerisi?
Yes, so,
Yeah.
sorry, did you have more?
No, no, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanna cut you off. I was gonna add, for context for the public and anyone listening, the House bill passed back in July and moved on to the Senate. So in terms of momentum, the bill that you referenced years ago, I don't even think got a vote. And so the House has shifted, right? So it did pass the House. And to Mr. Swigert's point, there is some momentum to try to get it at least on committee level in the Senate. And so appreciate you mentioning it. It is something we've mentioned in the legislative. It's something we've been talking about in the legislative committee that we've talked about as well. And that $1 million annual. So that's an annual $1 million saving, not a one-time saving. So it's it could be huge for our district and districts across the Commonwealth.
So it's an opportunity just to send notification to your elected official, which in this instance on the Senate side is Senator Haywood, to let them know that, you know, you would support House Bill 1422. Now, the downside on the Senate side is we don't have a majority probably to get this passed, but I think the urging and the support is always helpful. Just saying.
And this is something that has impacted districts, no matter your political affiliation. And so that's also where some of the momentum has picked up. The numbers that we experience, other districts, as you know, Mr. Swigert. So it's become less of a political item as it relates to this element of charter reform. Other elements of charter reform, we're not even talking about that at this point.
Set item 2, increased accountability, increased policy seem to be more political. The fair fund seems to be driving it, but I don't have my ear to the legislation like you guys do, so. That's it.
Dan?
2 notes. I just wanted to reiterate what was just said, but also underscore that it's my understanding is even if our representatives might support this legislation, it still helps to reach out to them because that gives them more grounding in knowing that their community believes in something. So anyone listening, anyone in the audience, please consider sending a note in support of this to Senator Haywood. And I would imagine to Representative Nelson as well, given that it might come back to the House in a modified form, potentially. The other question is inspired by Dr. Scriven's comment about what we have control over and what we don't have direct control over. That $1 million in savings to Cheltenham School District, it'd be wonderful if this passed, but it also represents an opportunity potentially for us to bring students back into our district, I imagine, because those are all students who could be, we could recoup that 1 million in a magical world where we have brought folks back into our district. So I just wanted to raise that as maybe an opportunity for us to think about in future of what can we do to try to understand why those students have chosen a cyber charter school and whether there are things we could put in place to attract them back. So it's more food for thought. I'm not asking for a response.
Well,
Just
I mean, as I'm processing it though, based on what Mr. Swigert is explaining, is that 1 million is simply what would be leveraged by adjusting what we are currently paying for those students that we're losing. So whether they came back or not, that 1 million is potentially money that would come back to us. It would be additional savings. We're really talking about 2 different things. I've always believed in, let's be clear, let's be transparent. This is simply dealing with an adjustment in where we are being overcharged for services when we have to outsource, versus taking a look at what we can do programmatically to bring students back if we were able to service them. So it's really 2 different tracks.
Absolutely, and to be clear, I was simply saying that this reminds me of the opportunity we have to, regardless of the 1 million, the 1 million is actually, to your point, just a portion, a portion of what we're paying cyber charter schools. But every student that attends a cyber charter school, my understanding is we are paying for that student.
Right.
If that student were to choose to disenroll from that cyber charter and come back to Cheltenham, we would recoup 100% of what we would have been paying. And so to that end, it was just this, before COVID, frankly, is when the last time I think we had this conversation with Fidelity about increases to charter schools in general, and trying to see if we could explore a strategy for understanding why students chose to attend a cyber or brick and mortar charter school, and maybe looking into ways we could strategically try to attract them back, or what could we do? So again, I'm not proposing a specific action item, but I'm just observing that it is an opportunity that we could pursue regardless of what happens with that bill. That's the bottom line.
Proceed.
And the one thing to keep in mind, even if House Bill 1422 doesn't get adopted, right now, my understanding is that the school code has not yet been adopted. So there might be some opportunity with the school code to get some of this language that's in 1422 incorporated into the school code, just as another avenue.
Any other questions on charter school spending? All right, if not, I will move on to the PennDOT purchase, which has morphed into the PennDOT eminent domain as a more what's that? An easier transaction to execute with less cost through the eminent domain. So essentially, PennDOT came in and made an offer. We negotiated with PennDOT regarding that offer to come to a final price, and rather than go through a school district sale, which involves school board approval and advertising, we chose to go the route of eminent domain, which is a simpler process after that number was reached. So the totality of the PennDOT purchase is a strip of land on the edge of Wyncote, as on this map outlined in red. The spot towards the intersection of Rice's Mill and Church Road is a lane expansion and a sidewalk primarily. When you get further back on the property, it's a lane expansion sidewalk. It's a slope easement and a drainage easement. So it's land that isn't even really usable by the district because of what it's already designated for. So the totality of this is 0.23 acres of school district property, 0.096 is for the right of way, 0.105 is for the slope easement, and 0.032 is for the drainage easement, and a total purchase price of $60,000 plus fees on top of that, fees incurred through eminent domain. Any questions on the purchase? Yes.
So traditionally for easements, they're non-possessory, they would not be actually property that would be taken over through eminent domain. So my question is, unless this is atypical or maybe also be a language issue, did PennDOT actually acquire 0.233 acres, or did it just acquire the right-of-way portion? And as part of that agreement, they had the right to make use for the slope and the drainage easement, but we still own the property. Realizing it's not a big deal because, as you said, that part of the property is useless to us anyway, effectively. Just out of curiosity, was it 2.33 acres they acquired, or 0.096, and they just have agreements for non-possessory use for the easements, where we still maintain the easement portion of the property?
So I don't 100% know the answer to that. The question is very technical.
I apologize.
That might be a first. Motion to stop the meeting right now.
Goes out to stop it.
So I believe the purchase price is applied right away when they talk about what the acreage actually taken for the eminent domain is the full 0.2233. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but probably doesn't directly.
It doesn't directly. Yeah, it's not a big deal. So the use of the word easement is not what it means in the traditional urban planning sense. But again, it's almost an irrelevant point because, as you suggested, and as I know, driving by numerous times, that land, the part they took, being very minimal acres to begin with, but also very steep slopes, has no value to us anyway.
Yes, they're essentially cutting into the slope, putting up a concrete barrier, one of those 4-foot concrete barriers, and the slope will meet the top of the barrier. So they're taking away heavily sloped land the whole way along that corner, which is useless to us, as you mentioned. I know last time we were here, you had discussed increasing the purchase price, which we did, so that we could afford to add some additional greenery and trees to that edge of the property when the project's complete to help with some noise impact of Church Road. So then we did increase that purchase price by several $1,000 to accommodate for that. And I really think the initial offer of PennDOT was a somewhat generous, let's get this done offer, because I believe they've wanted to get this project done for many, many years.
Mr. Swaggart, a couple of questions. Is this from the corner of Rice's Mill to Greenwood, so to Curtis Arboretum?
Our property line ends, and it doesn't quite go the whole way to that other intersection, but yes, that would be, if we were to follow this down, it would be the whole way to the.
So do they have to acquire the land usage where those properties are? There's about 3 properties.
They had to repeat this process for every property owner on that corner.
Okay.
And maybe even the other side as well.
And I know, because I was reading an agenda for the township, they also acquired part of Curtis Arboretum for similar purposes.
And I think I probably asked this the last time that this came up, just reiterating, while that it is a very small acreage, and while that is not a usable part of the Winco property is very small. And that, that's the playground you see, and there's a fence and a steep drop off. So it sounds like you said, Mr. Swaggart, that there is a plan to cut into the slope, and then they're building another wall or whatever. I guess my concern is just because it is such a drastic steep slope that I would hate for whatever, I am not an engineer, a planner, but whatever is being done down there to impact the actual slope, which the entire school is, or the yard is being held up by this giant retaining wall.
So that was a concern. So last year, PennDOT surveyed the area, they put stakes out. They came out with a set of plans. I met them there with Jeremy Mazer from Chester Valley Engineering, who was a civil engineer we were working with to review the plans with us, and to get a level of comfort with what they were doing. And we were very comfortable with what was happening.
Oh, that's fantastic, and excited that some trees or greenery or something is part of that to help, because it can be quite loud in that schoolyard.
And that necessarily wasn't their plan, because there is tree removal as part of that. So that will be needed after it's all said and done.
It's safer for kids to go from Rice's Mill down to
Absolutely.
the Arboretum.
Yeah, the sidewalk should be a bad.
Very much.
All right, any other questions on the PennDOT purchase? If not,
Joel or Jenny, did you have any questions before I go to the public?
Yeah, actually, I do have one about this. That $60,000, it just goes into our unallocated surplus, right? I mean, it's just money that comes in as if it were taxes or something, right?
it does, but typically when you sell a long-term asset or piece of property, you transfer it to capital reserve to then again turn around and use it for a long-term capital purpose, which would be my recommendation of this as well. Not that it's a lot of money, but you know, the original asset was a long-term asset for the school district, so that's what I would turn the proceeds into as well.
Thank you for that appropriate accounting answer. We have lots of
Seriously.
is that $60,000 in the multi-millions, but I'm glad I asked the question because thanks.
Do we have any questions from the public? And I'm assuming none on Josh online for questions?
I don't see any now.
Okay, Zachary?
Just a general comment back to the timeline. It's not necessarily about the timeline itself. But as you are working with principals, I actually wanted to preface it with the board and the public. We've heard a lot of information about MTSS, what resources might be purchased or changed, and from principals in the update meeting, thinking through using their data and what resources might they need based on that. And so it would be helpful for, as budgets are being determined and presented, if there's just even a snapshot, these are the types of resources that are being requested or discussed as we make along the time, not at the end, but as we are going, as soon as possible, as we are going through that timeline, so that as we're making decisions about the budget, as the public is listening to it, we can turn those numbers into, like, what does that mean for students and teachers and things
Dan?
I'll just, you can tell I know I didn't raise mine.
Just
For
for
financial
like that.
affairs co-chair hat on, just for, in past budgets, we have had some of the explanation for what are the new projects that are being explored or pursued. So I think that is in line with what we've done. So just wanted to say received on the board and co-chair side of things as well.
Any other questions?
Just a really short comment based on what you were saying. During the curriculum audit that we had done several years ago, that was really one of the charges to the administration and the board as we're building our budget to make sure that it really aligns with what our curriculum needs are, to basically get the outcomes that we're trying to move towards.
I wish I would have said I researched that and I actually pulled that up. And I was,
So I listened.
Wouldn't know.
Right, yeah, I would've known.
That's like
Right.
2015.
Yeah, it's a long time ago.
4 years ago.
Nah.
Motion to adjourn.
Yeah. Motion to adjourn. Oh, yes.
Motion to adjourn,
So moved. That's my second.
meeting is adjourned.
All right.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I remember.
Aye.